2021 proved to be another wretched year for cybersecurity professionals, from crippling attacks on critical national infrastructure to the persistent exploitation of zero-day vulnerabilities. It has truly been a torrid time for businesses trying to stay safe. Of course, IT Pro has covered every major hack, breach and scandal over the past 12 months, so let's take a look at some of the most calamitous cases from the last year. Businesses relying on Microsoft Exchange will be all too familiar with the problems it faced in 2021, with zero-day exploits and vulnerabilities emerging from every corner. The problems began in March when the Hafnium hacking group chained together 4 previously unknown zero-days to compromise around 30,000 on-premise servers in a sophisticated hack. Microsoft issued patches after the hackers were able to lift data from servers remotely, but it wasn't the end of its Exchange woes. A series of additional zero-day vulnerabilities were discovered a month later, including 3 identified by the NSA. Further down the timeline, the proxy token authentication bypass flaw was unearthed in August, and it also suffered a spate of attacks involving Catbot and Squirrel Waffle mouse spam in October. It wouldn't be a year in cybersecurity without Facebook's token annual PR crisis. No, not the Frances Haugen whistleblowing incident in the latter half of the year. Much earlier in April, Facebook was met with a humongous data scandal which ultimately set the tone for a rocky few months at one hack away. Personal data belonging to 533 million users was made accessible on a popular deep web hacking forum. The startling figure represented around a fifth of the social media network's entire user base. The story actually began in 2019 after hackers scraped data from Facebook's servers by exploiting a misconfiguration in its contact importer. Using the data, the hacker went on to set up a little business operating through the encrypted messaging service Telegram. The database created by the hacker could be queried by anyone in return for a small fee, allowing clients to use the database and find phone numbers linked to Facebook profiles. After a short while, the hacker eventually changed tack and dumped all the data online for free. The double extortion ransomware siege on Colonial Pipeline was among the most widely reported attacks of 2021. It was also arguably the biggest and most disruptive attack of the year. The firm managing the 5,500-mile pipeline between Texas and New York, which is responsible for providing around 45% of the East Coast's fuel, cut off its supplies as it was brought to its knees for 6 days back in May. According to reports, Colonial Pipeline went against industry advice and paid the $4.4 million ransom the following day, but it took several additional days to secure its systems and restore operation to its main lines.
It's the recommendation of the FBI to not pay ransom in these cases, as you well know, for good reason, because it can incentivize similar attacks, additional attacks.
Russian-linked ransomware gang DarkSide took credit for the attack, which sparked widespread hoarding among consumers as supplies ran short. The Department of Justice ultimately recouped most of the payment, but the sheer scale of the event catalysed a shift in attitude for US lawmakers, with ransomware being promoted to terrorism status shortly after the incident.
This weekend's events put the spotlight on the fact that our nation's critical infrastructure is largely owned and operated by private sector companies. When those companies are attacked, they serve as the first line of defense, and we depend on the effectiveness of their defenses.
Soon after, DarkSide went underground and introduced an internal process to ensure attacks of a similar magnitude never happened on their watch again. The supply chain hack on Kaseya crippled millions of devices and has a strong argument for the worst cyber incident of the year. Kaseya's VSA product was the target of Russian ransomware outfit Revil, which targeted VSA due to its ability to push updates to clients without their intervention. Revil used a zero-day to launch its ransomware attack, which eventually reached more than 1,000 of its clients, infecting more than 1 million devices. The real kicker? Kaseya actually knew about the security flaw and was working with a Dutch cybersecurity company to fix it at the time. In a real race against the clock, Kaseya ultimately lost to Revil, who were able to exploit the flaw before a patch could be released. Kaseya maintained it did not pay Revil's frankly obscene ransom demand of $70 million and acquired a decryptor through a mystery third party weeks after the attack. That's not before its servers were shut down and numerous affected clients were bombarded with phishing campaigns under the guise of Kaseya security updates. The aptly named Print Nightmare fiasco arose at the start of July after a truly unfortunate misunderstanding led to a reputable cybersecurity vendor publishing a working exploit for an unpatched vulnerability. In what can only be described as a comedy of errors, Microsoft initially patched a privilege escalation vulnerability in its print spooler component in June, but 2 weeks later upgraded the severity of the bug to remote code execution, or RCE. Researchers at Sangfor, meanwhile, were conducting their own research into print spooler vulnerabilities, research they were scheduled to debut at Black Hat weeks later. When Microsoft upgraded the severity of the now patched print spooler flaw, the researchers published a proof-of-concept exploit for an RCE flaw ahead of time, mistakenly believing this to be the same vulnerability that Microsoft had patched in June. This meant a working exploit for a Microsoft RCE was out in the wild, work typically only carried out by a malicious hacking group, but this time it came from a reputable cyber firm. By the time Sangfor realised this mistake and took its report down, the exploitation was already being distributed across the hacking community. Microsoft promptly issued a patch, but this ultimately proved unsuccessful after another researcher published a workaround. A working fix wasn't made available by Microsoft until 12 days after the initial flaw was leaked, and the successful second attempt brought with it fixes for 117 other flaws in what was a monster Patch Tuesday. The horror story that's perhaps at the forefront of people's minds is Log4Shell, the remote code execution zero-day vulnerability in a key Java library thought to affect most Java-based and other enterprise applications around the world. Discovered in December, it was a genuine nightmare before Christmas as security teams scrambled to understand their exposure to the vulnerability. Experts said it would take a long time before the true breadth of the attack surface is realised, and figures revealed in January 2022 showed that more than half of Log4j downloads were still vulnerable a month after discovery. Cyber attackers can utilise a long-known exploitation method known as Java Naming and Directory Interface, or JNDI injection, to achieve remote code execution on vulnerable versions. Since its discovery, the threat to businesses has been great, with early figures revealing scores of exploit attempts just in the first few days after discovery. Over in the US, the FTC has also threatened legal action against companies failing to patch vulnerable Log4j versions, given the risk it poses to the cybersecurity posture of the nation. For more on cybersecurity and many other business IT topics, visit us online and don't forget to subscribe to the IT Pro channel.